So it's always super exciting when I find a new technique for you. Now, I have scoured YouTube to see if I can find that anyone has done this before, and I can't. If you've seen this technique before, let me know in the comments, because I would love to go along and take a look at someone else's take on it. But this is something that I imagined up myself. I haven't given it a name yet, but it's basically embossing your embossing powder. Not embossing in a folder and then heat embossing it. It's the other way round. Now check out these cards that I've made using this technique. So melting embossing powder and then running it through in an embossing folder. How cool is that? Is it the embossed embossing technique? I don't know. Let me know in the comments what you would call it. It's so quick and easy, and I bet you've got everything at home already to be able to do it. And not only that, I have made some really pretty and simple cards using this technique, making my own embellishments. They're almost like enamel pieces. But what I've also done is managed to make some beautiful cards from the waste. So this is the waste from making this card, so cool. And this is the waste from creating this one. I'm going to show you how to do all of this in this tutorial. Things you're going to need is all of your old embossing powders. I've got so many here. There's colours that I have not used for years, and there's colours that I've used a tiny amount of for a project, never touched them again. You're also going to need embossing folders. I'm going to be focusing on this fabulous 3D embossing folder from Tim Holtz today to show you the technique, but you don't have to use a 3D one. You can also do this with a 2D embossing folder. You're going to need some kitchen towel and some general kitchen baking or grease-proof paper. Now, side note, I did try this technique with wax paper or deli paper. I thought it would actually work better with the wax on it, and it didn't. It was much, much harder. I basically could not release the embossing powder. So definitely baking grease-proof paper is the right paper to use for this. You're also going to need something to protect your surface, your desk or your mat from the heat that you're going to be using. I have the Tonic Studios Tim Holtz Grip Heat Resistant Mat. This is absolutely perfect because it stays cool underneath whilst I'm heating the top. And then afterwards you may want to use some basic shape dies or some gilding wax to decorate. So I'm going to put my heat resistant mat down first of all to protect my surface, and a folded piece of greaseproof or baking paper on there. Now you need to make sure this is larger than the piece that you want to create, but still small enough to fit into your embossing folder and fit through your machine. It doesn't matter if the paper overlaps the folder, but it all needs to fit through the mouth of your die cutting machine. When you come to do the embossing in your die cutting machine or embossing machine, you aren't going to have very long. So make sure it's all set up, your machine is set up with the right settings and pressure ready for you to use it. So let's start with the basics. Let's just put some embossing powder, this is without ink, down onto my greaseproof paper. Now I'm sprinkling this. It's a few millimeters thick. I'm not going towards the edges, and I'm keeping it all together, making sure that there's no gaps in the powder there. Now you're going to use quite a bit of powder for this if you keep creating pieces, but for me it's perfect for using up those colours I don't often use. Then you want to fold over your greaseproof or baking paper onto the powder. As you can see, I'm quite close to the edge there, so I'm going to be careful of that. Now the reason we've got some kitchen towel is simply to protect our fingers from touching the hot embossing powder through the greaseproof paper whilst we're heating it. So keeping this closed so that no powder blows anywhere, you want to start heating. Now this technique can be done with a craft iron or a normal household iron. I've not tried that yet, but I've seen other people melt embossing powder in this way. I've not done it for this technique. I've used my heat gun, but by all means try it, and again let me know in the comments how it went for you. Now this part of the technique is a bit of a spin-off from a tutorial a while ago by Marion Embossing. I will link that up here for you. She used wow embossing powders. It's a beautiful technique. It's very different at the end. We finish differently, but this is how I melt my powder, very similar to how she does. Make sure you check her video out too. So I'm just going to turn my heat gun on and start heating. Now this is going to take longer than it usually would if you were heating powder stuck to ink on a piece of cardstock. So be careful, do keep the heat moving at all times. You'll be able to see through the paper, which we'll see in a moment, sped up. You'll be able to see that the melted powder sticks to the paper and it will go slightly darker, so you'll know that that area is melted. Now I also use the kitchen towel for just gently pressing the paper down onto the melted embossing powder so I can see a little clearer which bits have melted. And once I think that's all melted, I turn it over and warm the other side to make sure there's no unmelted powder on this side too. Now I don't want this to be too thin, and it does often come out very, very thin and fragile. So when I'm touching with the kitchen towel, I'm doing a very, very light burnish. I'm not pressing down too hard at all. So this is where you need to be quite fast. Now that's all warm, both front and back, pop that into your embossing folder and directly into your die cutting machine. I've got mine just off to the side here, and I'm going to run that through immediately. I'm going to run it through quite slowly, but I don't want to take so much time that the embossing powder cools down too much. You should be able to feel a decent amount of pressure the same way as you would if you were embossing paper. And if you carefully have a look without taking it out, you should see that your paper is embossed. Take a look at it both sides too, whilst trying to keep it in the same place in case for any reason you do need to run it back through. If you haven't embossed that enough and you think that you need a little more pressure, warm it back up again, take it out, warm it up again, pop it back through. You can remelt it and run it through a few times. I'm more than happy with that. I can see that has got a really nice emboss, so I'm going to put things to the side and allow that to cool. Now this is where it gets a little bit messy, but for me it's absolutely worth the time and trouble to take this paper off carefully, little piece at a time. Once cool, you can peel back the wax or greaseproof paper, and you'll find, because you've got a really nice deep emboss there, some of it will stick. So peel off what you can, and then as long as it's completely cool, you can take something like a pokey tool if you need to, or even just your fingers, and pick off any bits of paper that are remaining. They will actually come away really easily. You just need to find an edge to lift them from. So now that one side is finished, I can come to one of the edges and peel off the backing. Now the edges are going to be extremely fragile and they may crumble a bit. This is lovely for a distressed effect, but if you want a sharper edge, stay tuned, because the next tip I'm going to give you is about shaping these. Now don't forget to take a look at the reverse as well. It may be that you prefer the pattern on the back, but if not, you can go ahead and you can highlight the raised areas of this now. As I say, it's quite fragile, it's quite easy to crack it, but once it's adhered to your card or your project, you'll be absolutely fine. My favourite is to go with a gilding wax. I've got one from the Colorology range, which is exclusive to CraftStash. I'll make sure it's linked down in the description below. But just to pick up the raised areas of this, it's such a beautiful and expensive looking enamel style embellishment. This is the sort of thing that if you were to buy them in a pack ready made, you'd be spending an absolute fortune. But you can now make them in any colour you want, any size you want, any shape you want, and with any texture or design you want to. So as you can see there, just picking up with the gold on my finger and picking out some of the detail. It's so, so beautiful. And of course, the darker the embossing powder, the more that gold is really going to come out. But what if you do want this into a shape? So there's another step that we can take before we do the embossing to ensure that we get this beautiful clean shape instead. So this time I'm going to do exactly the same into my folded up greaseproof paper. I'm going to be using this basic outline die, so I need to make sure that my powder is slightly larger than this, and I'm going to cover the area that I need, both width and height, and just check with this that it's okay. Yep, perfect. And it does flatten ever so slightly during the heating process anyway, but you can mix your colors. You don't have to stick with one color. So I'm going to add just a tiny bit of green to this in a couple of places, just to give it a little bit of an almost a patina look. So this is going to hopefully look like old metal when I've finished with it. We shall see. So once again, we're going to close this up and we're going to do that heating process. And once again, that's heated, and I'm actually this time going to release the wax paper, or rather the baking paper, before I do the embossing. So this is something that you can also do whether you are going to be die cutting or not. It does help the release of the greaseproof paper afterwards a little bit. Wait for it to cool. You definitely need to wait for it to cool and then peel back. Now, as you can see, we have got a little bit here which hasn't quite melted. There's a little bit of powder there, so I'm just going to put that back and warm that area up again. You can see how that area has gone wet again. Just give that a tap to make sure that that's all melted again from the back, and just let that cool again before we peel that back off. Now both sides will look a little different. I really love the swirls in that side. So I think I'm going to probably use that as the front, but we shall see. Either way, we need to die cut this, and we're going to die cut this in the same way as we would if we were die cutting paper. So I'm just going to take the shaped die that I've chosen and use just a little low tack tape to hold it still on the splash of embossing powder, so in 2 places to make sure that doesn't move. Again, I can't reiterate enough, make sure this is completely cooled before you do this. And then I'm going to pop this into my die cutting machine in the same way as I usually would. Now, of course, gently release your tape and the excess from the outside. And it's entirely up to you if you want to keep the excess. I'm breaking mine away because I know that I'm not going to use this. But as I showed you with the heart card at the beginning, the excess absolutely can be used on another card. Keep it anyway if you can. Have a go. It may be that you throw it, but you really haven't lost anything. So now I've got my shape, I'm going to place it back into the wax paper. And this time I'm just going to warm it. I'm not going to go for this to be completely melted because we will lose the shape. So we want to warm it from a distance just enough to make it a little bit pliable for the embossing folder. Okay, I'm happy that that's warmed and softened. So again, straight into my embossing folder, no messing around, and pop this through. I just need to adjust the settings because I was just die cutting, but we'll get this through as quickly as possible while it's still warm. Worst case, if you take your time running it through and it's hardened too much and doesn't emboss, you can always remelt, rewarm the embossing and try again. So at first glance, it looks like that has embossed beautifully. I'm happy with that on both sides. I'm just going to lift a little of the greaseproof paper up to check. Yeah, I've definitely got an emboss in there. And then comes the time when you actually need to think about peeling this greaseproof paper off. So some of this is coming away beautifully, but there will still be a few bits where it's cracked left over, as in the center here. I can pick most of those off with my fingers. So there's the beautiful piece so far. I'm going to take a silver gilding wax on this one and just pick out some of that detail with my finger. This already has some hints of silver in it because it was kind of a pewter, maybe sort of a charcoal pewter type embossing powder. I've got hints of green in there as well, very subtle but still there. And this is hopefully going to look like an old iron metal embellishment, which is just absolutely beautiful, and something which you can do with cardstock, but I just don't think you get quite the same effect. So picking out these flourishes, making sure there's lots of gilding wax on those. They're absolutely beautiful. I love that. Again, you can, of course, just have a go at putting the gilding wax or whatever medium you are using over the top. Don't forget you could use something like Stays On ink as well. Swipe the ink pad over the top maybe. There's other like the foundry waxes from Tim Holtz. You could try those. Gelatos maybe. You know, there's lots of mediums that will stick to this sort of surface. So there's the other side as well. Really, really beautiful. In fact, I think I do love that one most, but really, really stunning. Now I've got one more tip for you if you are not going down the die cutting route. So this time I'm really going to be mixing up my powders, different colours in there. Once you put the powders on and they're touching other powders, you can't put them back into the pot though, so just be aware of that if you want to mix your colours a little bit. So I'm going with lots of greens and teals here, and then a little bit of gold as well. So all of those are mixed up, and I'm going to close this and warm them up as we have been so far. Now, as I said before, if you release your paper, your greaseproof paper, before putting it into your embossing machine, then you are going to have a much easier job of peeling the paper off of the embossing powder afterwards. For this one, I'm going to let it cool and then peel back that, and it's so beautiful. It looks absolutely stunning, but I am concerned that it may be a bit thin, and it may be that if you are not die cutting, that is a little bit too thin for you. Now that would look absolutely beautiful on its own on a card, and this is similar to the pouncing technique that I mentioned before by Marion Embossing, so do check that out. But we're going to take it a step further. I'm actually going to add a thin layer of clear embossing powder here over the top. So probably this not quite as thick as the layer that we've just done, but not too far off. And this is just going to thicken up that powder a little bit more. We're going to melt this again in the same way. That will remelt the powder underneath. It will melt this, it will all stick together, and it will give us a slightly thicker finished result. Now you can really see on this piece where it's starting to go darker as it's melting, which tells me that that part has melted through. Okay, now once again, while it's warm, pop it into your embossing folder. I'm going to be using a slightly different embossing folder this time, but still a Tim Holtz one, and this is a 3D folder. Now I absolutely love this embossing folder, so I'm really excited to see how this one has come out. Now, as usual, I do need to release the paper. It didn't come away quite as easily as it has done from others, but I'm just going to pick this away first. This piece is so cool because at the edges where I put that clear embossing powder on, not only has it strengthened the coloured powder, it's also given me a slightly wider edge, which is going to give me kind of a faded outlook to it. So if I put it onto white, you can see the lovely bright colours, but I'm going to now pick this out, as I said earlier, with some StazOn ink rather than with gilding wax. Gilding wax would look fabulous, but I think I want to try some black on this. So I'm going to use a brayer with this. I do have some StazOn remover solution, so I can clean my brayer up well afterwards. I'm going to really load up the brayer and go over the top. This is picking out the numbers, which is so cool. It looks amazing because then all the coloured embossing is being left in the backgrounds. I absolutely love this. I'm going to hold this up. In fact, I'm going to put it onto a piece of white cardstock for you in just a moment. This is just the most fun background I think I've ever created. This is just absolutely fabulous. There we go. Okay, so let me just clean things up and put this onto some white cardstock. So I've got myself a card base here. To adhere this, you can either use something like a wet glue. That will stick absolutely fine, but you do need to give it time to dry. I'm going to use foam pads here. These stick very well as well. Any sort of foam adhesive. With these, because I'm using a white card base, I'm using the white pads. But of course, if you're using a darker colour, you can buy darker or black coloured foam, adhesive foam to use instead. I wouldn't suggest hot glue because of course you do risk then melting the embossing powder again. So how cool is that for a background? It's even raised up slightly. You've got the faded out edges. It's absolutely beautiful. I am so in love with this technique. Let's take another quick look at the cards that I created right at the start for you. So I cut out this star and added gilding wax to it and a few splashes of colour around that. I did this stripy kind of ombre effect rather than mixing the colours as I did here. I actually just laid them out in lines. I then embossed them with a 2D embossing folder and cut them with scissors. So I cut the embossing powder with scissors once it had completely cooled and dried. And as you can see, as I cut the edges, I ended up with these two strips, which is, there's nothing in between here. These are the two strips that came from the edge of this panel when I cut it up, and I thought that, do you know, actually funny enough, this is probably my favorite of all of them. I love this even more than the original card, but I really love the purples, blues and greens in there. And then, as I've shown you already, I did do the heart. So this was some red and browns embossing powders, much like this, sprinkled them into little areas and mixed them up. die cut the heart, ran it through the embossing folder, which you've seen me do with this black version that we did here, the black and silver, and then the excess piece, I didn't emboss it, but I did just glue it onto a card, stabbed a sentiment in the middle. So I hope you love this technique as much as I do, and I'd love to also know if you can think of a name for this technique if you've not seen it already, like I haven't. Let me know in the comments if you've ever seen anything like this before, or if you're going to be trying it out also. And I'd love it if you haven't done already, if you could subscribe to my channel. Take care, and I'll see you again very soon.